The door seemed like it was carved by someone obsessed with pain. It was a 2-story slab of copper embedded in a cavern wall, covered in a disturbing and complex relief. The design was of human bodies, twisted and tangled together, climbing upwards in a desperate mass. Their faces were gaunt, sunken, and full of terror. Some looked over their shoulders as if fleeing something unseen. The figures were starving, with ribs jutting out, their bellies bloated from hunger. There were whispers that these figures moved, but only when you weren't looking. Less than a week after the door was found, it was blown up with explosives. We didn't fully understand what we had uncovered, though some of us, especially the religious ones, had suspicions. The door wasn't just odd, it was wrong. It shouldn't have been there, buried deep within a cave. Natural caverns in Britain don't run that deep, definitely not 1,000 meters. As scientists, we should have been thrilled. But instead, the door repelled us. Staring at it too long stirred an instinctive urge to flee, as if some ancient part of us knew it was dangerous, like how we avoid things that slither or decay. We weren't told how they discovered the door or why the project was classified. All we knew was that our job was to figure out what lay on the other side. When the explosives went off, it was like a string of fireworks, one by one, shaking the entire cavern. The door was pulled down, freed from its place in the rock. I remember blinking through the dust, watching as it lowered to the ground. The air that rushed out from the opening was hot and dry. Somehow, that made sense. Deep down, I'd already convinced myself the door led to hell. A hell with stone walls, chains, and the stench of sulfur. But what we found wasn't at all what we expected. The first thing we saw were shelves carved right into the cavern walls, rising so high our lights couldn't reach the top. Everywhere we looked were endless rows of books. The floor was cluttered with piles of them, as if no one had bothered to organize anything. It felt like a maze, with random stacks making it hard to see what was ahead. The books were strange. They came in all shapes and sizes, with covers made of leather, fabric, and faded colors. The pages were thin, almost transparent, and covered with unfamiliar symbols and letters. It felt wrong to touch them, like we were doing something we weren't supposed to. The deeper we went, the more unsettling it became. There were no sounds except our footsteps and the loud beating of our hearts. Every now and then, we'd stop, certain we were about to see something, but there was only more silence. 6 hours passed before we reached a massive mezzanine overlooking a bottomless chasm. Below us, floor after floor was packed with shelves of books, so many it was impossible to count. It felt like a twisted, endless library, like staring into a dark, ancient beehive filled with knowledge we were never meant to see. We took a break there. Our radios didn't work well in this place, but we managed to wire a connection back to the main research site to update them. We were supposed to explore for another 6 hours, but honestly, it already felt like too much. I wanted to leave, to make sure there was still a way back to the surface, to reality. The air felt strange down there, like it wasn't real. There were 6 of us, 3 scientists, 3 soldiers. The soldiers were tense, scanning the dark with their lights. I appreciated their caution, but it put me on edge too. To break the silence, the other scientists started talking, convincing themselves this was an incredible discovery that would rewrite history. But none of us really believed it. We were afraid. We cautiously opened some books, flipping through pages but quickly putting them back. One of my colleagues, Dr. B, found a book with letters she recognized, maybe German, she thought. A soldier who spoke German took a look but shook his head. Not German, he said. Similar, but not quite right. Then there was Dr. Grant. He'd been quiet the whole time, staring intensely at the books in front of him. When we finally got his attention, something was wrong. He was pale, sweating, and muttering to himself. One of the soldiers put a hand on his shoulder, and he snapped out of it, laughing nervously. "Oh, sorry," he said, looking at us with wide eyes. "These books, they're records of our sins." We stared at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" I asked. He smiled darkly. "These books," he said, "are a list of every sin committed by every person, in every language, ancient, modern, and even languages that don't exist yet. Every single sin, past, present, and future." As he spoke, the soldiers moved closer, their expressions shifting from concern to fear. Grant kept rambling, convinced of what he was saying, while the rest of us shared worried glances. The deeper we went into this place, the less sense it made, and the more terrifying it became. "Grant, I'm going to have one of the men go with you, okay?" I said. He glanced at the book in his hands, eyes distant. "These are mine," he muttered, waving the book around. "All of them, not just what I've done, but every petty sin. All recorded with names, places, even diagrams. But there are also sins I've only thought about, things I wanted to do." His laughter turned eerie. "Sins I haven't even committed yet." He flipped to the last page, tears forming in his eyes. "Just one more. The final sin I'll ever commit. Grant." Before anyone could stop him, he dropped the book and sprinted toward the edge, leaping off without hesitation. Maya was standing near a corridor, her light tracing a wire stretching into the darkness. "This is the way we came, right?" she asked. One of the soldiers looked at the wire and then at his compass. "No," his superior, Mikkel, said with a frown. "We came from the south. This is heading north." "We trust the cable," B said, pointing at it. "It's connected to HQ. We spoke to them just a few minutes ago, so it must lead out." "I agree," I added, "but I marked our way with chalk, and my mark is over there." I pointed at a third doorway. Despite the confusion, most of us voted to follow the cable. As we walked, B suddenly broke the silence, her voice uncertain. "Do you think there's really a book in here for everyone?" Grant had certainly believed so. "If he's right, there are 100 billion books," I said, "and more if the library records future sins too." Up ahead, a soldier raised his fist, signaling us to stop. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. We strained to listen. A soft rustling sound came from deeper in the shadows. Moving quietly, we followed the sound until we found its source, a door, slightly ajar. One of the soldiers nudged it open with his rifle. Inside was another corridor, but this one was different. Shelves lined the walls, and instead of books, they held heads. Row after row of pale, gaunt heads, their lifeless eyes staring blankly. Their mouths moved in a strange, wet whisper, like rubbery jaws trying to form words without lungs to breathe. The sound chilled me to the bone. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached one of the heads. Its cloudy eyes fixed on me as I reached out and picked it up. The skin was cold, the neck dripping brown fluid onto the shelf. Every other head stopped whispering and turned to stare at me, their expressions twisted with anger. I quickly set it back down, and the whispers resumed. "What the hell is this?" B asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mikkel scanned the shelves with his flashlight, revealing more heads stretching into the darkness. What is this place?" A strange idea crossed my mind. I knelt down in front of one of the heads and asked, "Blink if you understand me." To my shock, it blinked once. "Okay, once for no." twice for yes. Do you understand? I asked again. Blink. B leaned in. Are these books a list of all our sins? Blink. Blink. One book for one person? Blink. Blink. Then what are you? B asked, but I stopped her. Yes or no questions only, I reminded her. One of the younger soldiers stepped forward. Is this hell? Blink. Blink. Is this your punishment? He added. Blink. The heads began to make strange, warping noises, their mouths curling into grotesque smiles. Slowly, it dawned on me they were laughing at us. Suddenly, the wire we'd been following disappeared into a hole at the base of a wall. HQ, can you read me? One of the soldiers asked, speaking into his headset. We've hit a wall. We need help. The voice on the other end giggled, high-pitched and malicious. Then the ground rumbled. Stones began falling from the ceiling as the wall in front of us lurched forward. Run! I shouted, scrambling backward as fast as I could. The wall was moving, crushing everything in its path, including one of our soldiers. His scream was cut short as the wall rolled over him, leaving behind a pool of blood. We didn't stop. We ran, fear driving us forward as the laughter from the headset echoed in our ears. I lost track of time as we kept running. Pain and exhaustion made every second feel endless. My legs were heavy, like they could give out at any moment. It felt like I had been running for days, not hours. The featureless stone floor stretched on, and the rhythmic pounding of my feet faded into the background. All I could hear was the relentless grinding of the advancing wall behind us, promising nothing but agony if we stopped. I could barely think, only focus on the exhaustion that was dragging me down. More than once, I wondered if I should just give up. The memory of that moment still haunts my nightmares, being trapped, chased down a never-ending corridor. It wasn't fast, but fast enough that stopping wasn't an option. Ahead of me, there was only darkness, broken by the flickering light of a torch. Behind me, death was catching up. Suddenly, a voice cut through the dread. What's your problem, lady? I glanced up and saw a young man struggling as B tried to pull him through an open door. M and I didn't hesitate. Together, we grabbed them both and dove through the door just as the wall closed in behind us, plunging the corridor into darkness. We were left panting on the floor, surrounded by rows of severed heads, their eyes fixed on us in silent irritation. When I looked back, the hallway was gone. In its place was a pulsating wall of flesh, hot, sticky, and threaded with sickly blue veins. Nell hissed. It was a trap. We were led down the wrong path. He didn't know how, but it didn't matter now. Davis, another soldier, was gone, crushed by the wall. The realization hit hard. Mick grimaced as he gestured forward. There's only one way now. We pressed on, with the severed heads following us with their eyes. Their constant muttering grated on our nerves, the papery sound of their lips hard to ignore. We walked for 6 hours before we finally took a break. Exhausted, we slept in a row, 2 of us staying on watch at all times. I stayed awake with Mick, while B and the other soldier rested. B had barely spoken since the encounter with the wall, only muttering something about teeth and faces, her eyes hollow and haunted. I didn't want to sleep either. I was terrified of dreaming about that hallway, about running from the wall again. The despair from that moment still weighed on me, making me feel like I was drowning. So I sat awake, trying to push the thoughts away, but they lingered. Eventually, though, I must have dozed off because I woke to see something dragging the body of the sleeping soldier into the shadows. His neck hung at an unnatural angle. It was slow and clumsy, like a child trying to sneak away with a toy. I nudged Mick awake, and as soon as he saw what was happening, he jumped into action. Together, we grabbed the soldier's legs and pulled, but something was wrong. His body was too heavy, too lifeless. He was already dead. Despite that, we fought to hold on, but whatever had him wasn't going to let go. Suddenly, B flew backward, slamming into a shelf, knocking loose a few of the heads that had been watching us. And then I saw it, a long, twisted arm reached out from the darkness, its fingers splitting into several joints, moving independently in a grotesque, unnatural way. I let go and fell back as Mick tried firing his pistol into the shadows, but it was no use. The body was yanked into the darkness, and we were down to 3. Then B, who had been silent, spoke softly. "It's not over." The creature reappeared, its massive hand landing on the floor. Slowly, it dragged itself into the light, its many black, bulbous eyes locking onto me. Its mouth was a tangled mess of dirty, rotting fingers that writhed like worms. Mick fired again, but it did nothing. The creature struck him aside with ease, and then it grabbed B. Her scream was cut short as the creature twisted her body, breaking her like a twig. I could do nothing but watch as her body fell to the floor, her face frozen in an accusatory glare. Mick screamed, still firing as the creature seized him next, squeezing him so tightly blood spurted from his mouth. Desperately, he reached out for me, begging for help. I ran forward, crouching low to avoid the creature's arms, and grabbed the gun from the floor. But by the time I stood up, it was too late. My hand froze just inches away. I hesitated, Mickle's blood dripping down, the sound of his ribs crunching echoing in my ears. In that moment of shame, I grabbed the torch and ran. Mickle's cries chased me, screams, whimpers, the horrible sound of bones breaking, and the tearing of paper. It felt like those sounds would go on forever. I stumbled out of the corridor, alone. It took only a few seconds for me to realize the monster had stopped chasing me. A few moments later, I found myself back on the mezzanine, terrified and exhausted. I wondered if it was even worth trying to escape, especially if it meant staying alive for another second in that place. I collapsed to the floor and started sobbing. Maybe it was time to jump off the ledge, just like Grant had. "What are you doing here?" I whipped around to see an old man in robes staring at me, looking like I didn't belong. Without thinking, I started to laugh. My sanity felt like it was hanging by a thread. He leaned aside to look down the long corridor behind me. "Why did you go down there?" he asked. I wanted to answer, but all I could do was laugh and gasp for air. "I think you really ought to go home," he said, like a teacher scolding a child. "This place is hell," I cried, rocking back and forth on my knees. Yes, good for you. This is a small part of hell, one that overlaps with Earth. I assume that's how you got down there the door. What happened to your friends?" I looked back in the direction I came and pointed. "Oh, I left your books out so you'd find them and figure it out." The bald fellow worked it out once he realized this place was hell. "Why did you waste another second here?" I shrugged, unsure of how to respond. "We got misled." "Fair enough. I probably should have done more to make sure you got home safely. That's partly my fault, though I won't apologize. You entered this place. Didn't you see the door?" "What part of that looked inviting?" "You have to take some blame too." I wanted to defend myself, but I had no excuse. When it was clear that I could only SOB and mumble, the old man's expression softened. He reached out a hand. "Come on, I'll take you back." "What about the demons?" The old man frowned. "Those were not demons. This place is meant for mortal souls to show repentance by wandering these nearly endless halls in search of their books. They can only move on once they find them. But with 86 quadrillion books, it takes too long for anyone to find theirs. So this whole wing was abandoned, leaving only sinners behind. That thing you saw was human. No soul looks human, especially not the kind sent to hell. This isn't for people who eat meat on a Friday or envy their neighbor's ox. It's for the cruel, the malicious, the cowards, and the opportunists. A lot of souls here have more in common with anglerfish and trapdoor spiders than with their fellow humans. After several thousand years, their souls change, twist, and so do their bodies. What about you? Why do you look so normal? Ah, that's because I built this place. As he gripped my shoulder, I felt a sudden heat. We woke up in our separate quarters. All of us. I still don't fully understand how it happened. I tried to ask the others how they made it back, but they weren't in a state to answer. B was catatonic, screaming and clutching her head, as if she still remembered how that thing crushed her skull like a grapefruit. The soldier who fell into the wall was left paralyzed, even though medical tests couldn't explain why. Psychological, I murmured. The other soldier, the one dragged into the shelves, was called Komos. I don't know if he recovered, but he was alive. Grant, however, was left in a permanent psychotic state, compelled to write on any surface he could find, over and over again, sin after sin, desperately trying to rewrite the book that had driven him to madness in the first place. And me? I tried very hard to kill him. He remembered being left to die in the dark, and I was glad they caught him before he could strangle the life out of me. I never found out what happened to him after several men managed to pry his hands from my throat. Despite everything, I hoped he found some way to recover. Then the door disappeared, thankfully with no one on the other side. I knew they were planning future expeditions. It was for the best. Something like this can't happen again. They have no idea what awaits them. And sometimes, I wish I could convince myself that the expedition never happened. Some days, even now, I hope that's true. There was no physical evidence. We appeared in our beds, completely naked, except for a note stuck to my chest. It was a final touch that stood out to me as stern confirmation of everything I'd experienced. Return to sender. 6 mortals. 5 were damaged in transit. Bodies repaired to the best of my ability, but I never was good at this. My soul? That's another matter entirely. I couldn't help myself in one case. I left a fellow mortal to die in the dark. It didn't seem very sporting. Don't let anyone say I lack a sense of humor. Otherwise, no harm, no foul. Best wishes, me. My heart sank when I heard them read it to me. It confirmed my worst fears. No one had been honest with me since I arrived in the hospital. They kept me bandaged up, so it was hard to tell. But when I heard the note, I finally found the courage to reach up and remove the thick fabric. With shaking fingers, I touched my eyes, or rather, the empty sockets where they used to be.